I'm very, very happy to introduce Ted Gibson, a professor of cognitive science at the Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT. Professor Gibson is the head of TED Lab, which asks very big, very difficult, and tremendously interesting questions, such as, and I pull this out of his own website, he's not shy about asking these questions. Why does natural language look the way it does? I mean, trivial question. What's the relationship between language, culture, and cognition? I'd like to know. How do speakers learn, represent, and process language? That's a hell of a lot. Okay, so Ted Gibson impressively uses multiple empirical methods, which makes him perfect for this conference: experimentation, statistical modeling, corpus analysis, functional MRI, ERP, and eye tracking. In addition to 5 books and special issues that he wrote or edited with others, Ted published way too many journal articles for me to count. I'm weak in numbers. And they are published in the most prestigious venues such as language, cognition, cognitive science, and many, many others. Today's talk is a great example, I think, of Ted's type of big question and big answer. Okay, discourse and processing approaches to syntactic island effects. Ted, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Mira, and thank you to you and the organizers for having me. Yeah, it's too bad we couldn't be there in person, but this has worked very well, I think. I'm one of those people that doesn't mind Zoom, so I actually think it's okay in some ways. And so yeah, the title of my talk today is, as Mira said, I'm just going to run a timer here so I don't go crazy time-wise here, is Discourse and Processing Approaches to Syntactic Island Effects. So broadly, I'm interested, I can ask the questions, Mira, I don't need to, I'm not always getting the answers. So I'm interested in how humans produce and comprehend language, mostly at the morpheme word and compositional rule level of language, and how understanding language processing and acquisition might give insights into how human languages look. And towards that end, my collaborators and I have looked into structures of words and sentences across many languages to look for generalizations. And we've actually found many such generalizations, I'd say, counter to the claims that Sabine and Balthasar were making earlier, but maybe we're talking about slightly different things. And you can see a recent article summarizing our other labs' results in this area, which was in Trends in Cog Science now 2 years ago. But today, what I want to do here is actually narrower than trying to understand why language looks the way it does in some way. So I want to probe the claim from Chomsky's generative syntactic framework that the unacceptability of certain kinds of structures called island structures is evidence that constraints that apply to these structures must be innate. And so I'm going to probe this using, I'm going to instead propose, following many others, a usage-based constructivist alternatives, arguing against the need for cross-construction constraints that are actually probably hard to learn, but I don't think you need them for these cases here. And so I want to acknowledge first my 4 main collaborators in this work: Yingtong Liu, who's a graduate student in linguistics at Harvard; Anna Beyer, I think she's here, is a professor at University of Paris in Diderot; and Barbara Hemforth, a research scientist at also University of Paris; and Elodie Winkel, who was a student at University of Paris under Anne and Barbara, and who's now a postdoc under Eva Dabrowska over in Germany, in Erlanger, Nuremberg. And the 5 of us have a review article coming out soon in the Annual Review of Linguistics, to which I will, this talk sort of follows some of that. Not all, it's a bunch of things. This is a new talk. It's putting together a bunch of work that really the 5 of us have done. Okay, so here's an outline of what I want to cover today. I'm just going to let you look at it quickly. I'm not going to go through it in detail. I'm going to bring it back when I do topic transitions. Briefly, I'm going to describe the constraint-based approach to syntax that has made island structures central to their program because of the need to have them an innate part of universal grammar. Then I'm going to present a rough alternative without those high-level constraints, which is arguably learnable. And I'm going to present data that is very difficult for the original conception of the constraint-based approach to handle, but which makes sense in a usage or construction-based setting. Okay, so as you're probably familiar, a dominant theory grammar starts with two general kinds of rules: merge locally and move anywhere. And then there are constraints on that movement. And universal grammar, UG, consists in part of universal constraints possibly to parameterize, which are blocking movement in some ways, such as the subjacency and barriers proposals, which I'll discuss briefly. And so, I just keep in mind in the context of, work on language that the Chomskyan program is Anglo-centric. It's actually not evaluated on a wide range of languages. It's mostly evaluated on English and related languages. Here, my background is relevant why I started working on this problem. I was trained as a computational linguist. I moved into psycholinguistics early in my career, basically in 91, 92. I learned Chomskyan grammar among all the other alternatives like head-driven phrase structure grammar and lexical functional grammar and categorical grammar back in the 80s, and was always interested in the claims and predictions of the strong versions here, like the Chomskyan grammar, and especially given my location. I am at MIT, and I'm in brain and cognitive sciences. I had a joint appointment with linguistics for many years, and so I was very familiar with the questions they were interested in. Those, that's where the center of some of that work is coming from, or had come from. The focus of this presentation is on island structures, which are unacceptable long-distance dependency structures. In case I probably most everyone here knows what these things are, but they're first noticed by Hodge Ross in 1967 in his PhD thesis from MIT, but he didn't make much of them theoretically. It's Chomsky and his colleagues who took island structures to be evidence for innate constraints on movement. And so here's two examples. This is an extract from Chomsky 77. I think this example is this contrast here. That's not very good. In English, he puts a star on it. And so it's not very good to take part of a subject and front it in WH question. And here's an extraction from a part of a noun phrase that's no good. So who did you hear the statement that the CEO promoted isn't very good relative to who did you hear the CEO promoted? This is not very good to pull out of a part of a noun phrase. So if that's like so-called complex noun phrase constraint or complex NP island, this is a subject island, the subject and noun phrase constraint, something like that. Critically for the constraint-based claim, it's the form of these, the syntax, which makes these unacceptable, not the meaning. So they're unacceptable across other kinds of constructions, which have different meanings. For example, WH questions, relative clauses, clefts, topicalizations. So here we have a parallel unacceptable subject island in a relative clause and a parallel unacceptable complex NP island in a relative in a relative clause. So it's not good to say, I met the man whose story is about terrified John. That's bad. Well, I mean, I'm just putting stars on there. They didn't do these examples. I just put them in here. These are the original examples are from Chomsky and various others. Okay, according to Chomsky's subjacency and barriers theories, there's too many syntactic nodes of some type between the WH phrase, the who phrase here, who here, and where it's coming from, its displaced position. So there's too many S and NP nodes in the original, subjacency hypothesis, and some variant in barriers. And the grammar allows connections crossing at most one of those kinds of nodes, but these sentences require movements crossing two or more, making them literally ungrammatical. So they're not generated by the grammar in this under this hypothesis. Okay, so that's as much background as I'm going to. But a little bit more. So the constraints on long distance dependencies are unlearnable and hence innate. This is the claim here because of the classic property of the stimulus argument. Since these constraints are structural and hold across all these different kinds of constructions, a child is unlikely to be exposed to the right input across all those different constructions. Each one, she's only exposed to examples of acceptable versions of sentences, and there's no instruction of direct negative evidence or to her to learn which long distance dependencies are ungrammatical and unacceptable. So this runs into, this is why these things are unlearnable and probably have to be part of the UG system under this constraint-based idea. Okay. Before I say more, I actually just want to point out that this doesn't work, okay, that the story doesn't actually work. So experimental work is already, recently our work and others probably has falsified the pure syntax view. I think some of the work with Nbaye And Barbara Hemforth and Elodie Winkle sort of falsified that. So we looked at, for example, if you change the construction, it turns out the strong claim here is that it shouldn't matter. It's been a very interesting and influential program. It turns out the empirical basis is lacking. So changing the construction greatly changes the acceptability. Corpus analyses show that extractions from relative clauses are okay in English and other languages. So here's this, I love this example from Jane Austen. I wish I could write like this, a letter of which every line was an insult. That is such a punchy line. Okay, and so that's observations of what people actually say or write. And in experiments, we show that it's actually okay to extract from relative clauses. The dealer had a sports car of which the color delighted the baseball player is okay compared to the WH extraction in a WH question. And I'm going to provide details about these examples later in the talk. And it's not just subject islands. For most types of islands, there's lots of evidence that the original optimism for a syntactic account has not worked out. Furthermore, the details across extraction position, subject islands, NP islands, WH islands, complements of factive verbs, there's all these different kinds of things which are unacceptable long distance connections. They don't give a unified theory of nodes, of syntax nodes that block the movement. I just want to point out, for now, that the syntactic account is currently not a worked out account. It was in the 70s and the 80s somewhat, and there was optimism, but it's not worked out at the moment. There's so many counterexamples to everything that I don't even think no one talks about those particularly in their papers, at least in my experimental people who work on this. So I'm saying nevertheless, current work in Chomsky and syntactic theories who are working on experimental approaches to understanding island constraints, for example, assume that syntactic accounts must be correct still, okay, without giving such an account. So under Sprouse, John Sprouse, Colin Phillips, and their colleagues' work, they take a super additive interaction, I'll say a little bit more about that, is in acceptability judgments as being diagnosis of a syntactic island as follows. So in this NP island example here from Sprouse et al. 2016, there's a 2x2 design crossing the distance of the extraction and the complexity of the structure, either having a complex NP or not having a complex NP. So we have local connections here. This is who heard, blah, 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 who heard, blah, 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 local connection versus two long distance connections here. Who did you hear the CEO promoted? Who did you hear the statement the CEO promoted? Two long ones. And then we have this extra noun phrase, the more complicated version in these two cases. And they just ask people to do ratings of these things, and they find that the long, complicated one, this is just their labels here, is worse. Is not just worse, but it's super additively worse than the other three. Okay, so there's a statistical interaction such that not only is this worse, but it's not a linear sum of the badness of the other two. There's something else going on which makes it extra bad. Okay. Okay, so this Sprouse and colleagues' claim is that islands are defined by this interaction, and which is unexplained by lexicon, discourse, plausibility, and they guess that the explanation is for why these things are bad is due to syntax. And but there's no working theory of syntax that explains the badness of these long distance dependencies. So the explanation still could come from lexicon, plausibility, discourse, and processing difficulty. We have no prior reason actually to think that the source of the superadditivity might be coming from syntax, because they actually don't give a syntax theory for this. And indeed, the design, even in this design here, I mean, just pulling this as one of theirs, it's intended to control for processing difficulty as a potential source for the observed interaction, but it doesn't. It actually doesn't. There's a confound here is the number of noun phrases between the WH filler and this dependent position. In the local ones, they're right beside who is right beside heard, but in the long ones, the who is actually closer in the simple than it is in the longer. So it could, this is just not a controlled experiment the processing complexity is at least as good as a potential explanation where we have some reason to think that longer distance connections with more NPs in between or more verbs in between are worse. Maybe that's the explanation here. Action is coming from the syntax is an inferential error. For example, I would like to see, Keshev and Meltzer-Asher actually showed that an interaction obtained in this paradigm for WH islands is probably due to unmatched processing factors, just like this, what I suggested here for this design here. And I don't want to say here that the experimental design here in 5 is bad, is inadequate. It just controls for some factors and not others. We always need independent reasons to interpret some superadditive interaction as coming from anything, the syntax or anywhere else. Finding this interaction doesn't determine the source of the effect. Each source is equally well on the table after seeing this observation. Okay, So as a consequence of this uncertainty of understanding the source of an island of a bad configuration, we're just going to adopt the simplest, I'm going to assume the simplest definition of island structure, which is just an unacceptable or like not very good long distance dependency with no claim about the source of the unacceptability. So I'm going to take this simpler definition so we can continue to refer to relevant configurations as island configurations independent of how we interpret them theoretically. So the problem with Sprous's definition is that you need to understand why a filler gap configuration is unacceptable in order to label it correctly. And our understanding may change over time. So it's just simpler, just let's define island configuration, which doesn't depend on understanding of the source right now. It's a minor, maybe a bit of minor point of terminology, but it often leads to confusion. And so that's why I wanted to clarify. What I mean by island is just unacceptable long distance dependency. What he means is one which is probably whose source is probably the syntax. I don't think that's a good way to go. So now let's move on to the constructivist approach to language, which is a slightly different here. So in contrast to the constraint-based view, in a constructivist theory, we have morphemes and words, which are forms which are associated with minimal meaning units, and we have the combinations of these, which are rules of compositionality, each which have a form and a meaning. So these are all constructions in Goldberg's terms. Critically, each of these is highly sensitive to frequency of use, for which we have lots of evidence now. That actually contrasts with the Chomskyan view, which just ignores frequency. It's not part of the framework. It instead focuses on possible versus impossible, which with this focus suggests the existence of categorical boundaries between acceptable, well, I guess grammatical and ungrammatical sentences, and for which we don't have any actual experimental evidence. I don't know if there's anything like that. And so so frequency is a big part of actual language, and I think that's a good part of usage-based theories that they build that in. So it's easy to find word frequency effects anywhere in natural tasks. This is a neat example of the brain sensitivity to grammatical surprisal, even when controlling for word base or n-gram surprisal. This is work from Ev Fedorenko's lab. This is a paper from Corey Shine and colleagues from Neuropsychologia from last year. And it shows a very strong 5-gram, which is like lexical and other pattern surprisal, and probabilistic context-free grammar surprisal responses in bold signal fluctuations in the language network of the brain for participants as they're listening to naturalistic audio materials. Listen to stories. It's the natural stories corpus, a corpus that Ev and I and Richard Futrell created quite a while ago. These are auditory stories that people are just listening to. They're kind of interesting. And you get very strong responses to word frequency. Here it's 5-gram surprisal, so it's not just words, but it's the sequences of words, and you get surprisal there. And so this is like word frequency, syntactic frequency, highly affecting people's responses in the brain to just listening to language here. And I go back to Nathaniel Smith and Roger Levy have a lovely paper from 2013, showing other corpora showing n-gram surprisal effects. This one's unique because it shows grammar, actual context-free grammar surprisal. It's a different dependent measure, but it's maybe a better one in some sense. Okay, in addition to core language knowledge, I think we need to assume some form of social knowledge, core social knowledge. And all I want to talk about here is the distinction between what's new information advancing the discourse or focus and what is known, which is anchoring the utterance in the existing or presupposed knowledge of discourse, which is like background, sort of foreground, background, actually focused to background. So there's some continuous knowledge here, the really backgrounded information to really new or focused information. I'll say more about this later when trying to account for some island phenomena. Many examples of so-called islands have been provided in the literature, with people, syntax researchers, asking us to infer about the source of the superadditive interaction to be syntax. My conjecture here, and I'm following many researchers before me, is that most of these are explained by other factors, such as lexical frequency, plausibility, incongruity, interference, nesting complexity. And we think, Ivan Sog has a lovely paper from 2010 sort of suggesting this, but he didn't have as much data as we do now for this same kind of claim. So the idea here is that maybe the intuitions that people have had are just based on confounded experiments for the most part. So you haven't done the right experiments. They just haven't constructed the right materials in some ways to really test the hypotheses that they were interested in. And the critical result actually in these experiments or intuitions, if there's no experiments, is almost always some kind of interaction. And it is actually kind of difficult to have intuitions about interactions, and therefore, it does point to the need for good experimentation. This is something that I've said before with Ev. We really need to do the experiments to say how everything was controlled, so others can look for confounds. See, moving forward. So moving on to some specific cases of island phenomena. First, I want to mention one syntax semantic success story, which is extraction from conjuncts, just so you get that one out of the way. So whereas there's disagreement in the literature on explaining most island effects, I think every other one, there is no disagreement that I know of to respect to certain conjunct islands, as in 6, 7, and 8, where one or several of the conjuncts have been extracted. So who did you invite Mark and is terrible in English. Can't do that. It doesn't seem to be possible to extract one or more conjuncts in any displacement construction, so not just relative clause, so not just WH questions, but also relative clauses. I met the man who you invited, Mark and is terrible also, in any language that I know of. I mean, this is something that Ivan and other people said. So consequently, researchers have unanimously explained these kinds of phenomena in terms of syntax and semantics, sometimes calling it something about the meaning of conjuncts, okay? So maybe a conjunct, so that is an analysis without movement, the definition of a coordination as a construction that necessarily implies at least two conjuncts can account for the O'Forminess here for all these cases. So this is one example of an island structure that receives a syntax or a syntax-semantics explanation, but note that you don't need the constraint-based approach to explain its unacceptability. It follows from an understanding of the form and meaning of conjunctions. So that's different from the broad claim about what subjacency and what barriers was trying to say. So now let me move on to, just checking my time here, I'm fine, okay, to some specific island phenomena that don't follow from the Chomskyan constraint-based view, and in many cases contradict his predictions, pretty directly. The first case I want to look at is from Yingtong Liu, her work looking at so-called factive and manner of speaking islands, which are in B and C. What did Linda know that Bill fixed doesn't sound very good. What did Sally whisper that Tom threw doesn't sound very good. Relative to a control, a so-called bridge verb example, like what did Maria say that Frank bought is okay? And then there's declarative versions all the way along here. It's kind of a 2x3 design here where, you've got Maria said that Frank bought something, and you've got that for all those three. The declarative versions are all okay. And what's supposed to be the critical judgment here is these WH questions out of factive verbs, across factive verbs like no, and across manner of speaking verbs like whisper don't sound very good. To account for these unacceptabilities of these bad examples, suggests that there's some covert noun phrase corresponding to a word like fact. This is from Kaparsky and Kabarsky way back in the 70s in Bolton, 1982, in such that a word like, so it's like there's some hidden noun phrase fact in there. So it corresponds to what did Linda know the fact that Bill fixed. So the badness of these materials might collapse to a complex noun phrase extraction. And something similar hypothesis was provided for manner of speaking verbs. So there's some empty noun phrase headed by a noun like whisper or saw or something in there. So what did Sally whisper that Tom threw is underlyingly something like what did Sally whisper that Tom threw or something, or the sound or something. I should point out there's no independent evidence for these claims. They're just proposed here to account for these intuitions that these are bad. But we can still, that's a problem for these kinds of accounts, that there's no actual proposed, there's no theory about what makes know and whisper different from think and say. But we can still test it, even if we don't think it's very reasonable. We can still look and see what the predictions are of this theory. So the predictions of the syntactic approach to these islands, along with a related semantic account. The declaratives should all be close to ceiling. These should all be, so like acceptability is rated up here. These should all be good, and for all of them. And then there should be some marked acceptability difference for the WH questions, with the baseline bridge verbs should be much better than the factive or manner verbs. Maybe all these things are down a bit and these are higher or something like that. Maybe there's a main effect of declarative versus WH question, but there's some critically some interaction between sentence type, which is these two types, declarative WH question, and the verb type. Okay, here's what you find, which isn't that, okay? There's a lot of variability. So these, what each dot here now is a lot of data for each verb, okay? So ratings for, there's each dot there can, you know, so maybe one of these dots is say, and one of these dots is think or something for these cases. And these dots, these factive verbs are, you know, actually this one I happen to know is know, K-N-O-W, and these are all the verbs of manner of speaking, and these are like verbs like the other factives are verbs like discover and stuff. And so one thing you can see, there's a lot, first of all, there's a lot of variability in both the declarative and WH questions. Doesn't really look like the hypothesis. And there's a large overlap, it turns out, between factive and bridge WH questions. So these red and green dots are highly overlapping. It's really just no, which is bad, it turns out. And so that's the one they always give as the example, and they make it sound like they're all factive like this, and it turns out it's just no that's like that. Third, there's a continuum of rating actually here. It's not like there's big clumps of things, it's just continuum. And then not only is there a continuum here, but there's a continuum over here, and it's such that, in fact, there's no interactions whatsoever. When you do the right statistics here, whatever you do, ordinal regression, or you do logistic regression here, we just got two, we don't have any interactions here, okay? So a closer inspection of the materials gives rise to a much simpler theory, it turns out. It could be that the frequency of the verb frame is predicting acceptability along with sentence type, declarative versus WH question, which is building an idea from Eva Dabrowska, actually, from 2008. And so if you just reanalyze the data in terms of verb frequency and sentence type, we see two simple main effects with no interaction whatsoever. So the declaratives are rated better than the WH questions. That's the red line above the whatever color that is, teal. And then there's also this highly reliable main effective frequency of the verb here, where we're just we collect those frequencies independently, where the frequency is the joint probability of the verb such that it takes a sentence complement. So we look up, here we did Google Books, you can do various things here. You just get big numbers, you can get better estimates from Google Books. You can do things in parse Corpus as well. So you can get good estimates for verbs like say and think, which are super common. It's kind of hard to get the S complement frequency for a verb like whisper, because it hardly ever occurs. You can get it from Google Books, but you can't really get it from, you know, some parse Corpus, because it hardly ever occurs. But anyway, either one of those doesn't matter. We get these very strong relationship between verb frequency and acceptability, and just another main effect of declarative versus WH question. And so you note here that most of the factive WH questions are actually acceptable, very acceptable. Like, what did Linda discover that Bill fixed is pretty good. It's only no that's really weird. And so maybe that's for some other reason. I'm not going to explore that here, but it's maybe because of pragmatic oddity of the question. If you ask a question like, what did Linda know that Bill fixed? There's an easier way to ask whatever you meant by that, which is, what did Bill fix? If Linda knew it, then why are you even putting that in there? There might be some complicated discourse reasons such as you might have, but in a null context, it's kind of weird. It's pretty weird. So maybe that's why this one is sort of off the lines relatively to the others. And then we redid. Okay, so this, to the extent that what did Sally whisper that Tom threw is unacceptable. To the extent, I don't know where whisper is here. It's somewhere over here. There it is. Is unacceptable. It's just a sum of the badness of Sally whispered that Tom threw something. I guess that's here, and the down jump for the frequency of this. And the left to rightness of the frequency of that verb is an S complement. It's not very good. It's pretty low frequency. So that's why you can predict that very well. In a second experiment, we actually ran a third as well, got the same result with a different construction. We have now not 24 verbs, so the first 24 verbs we got from Ambridge and Goldberg, and this was extending that, pushing to 48 verbs. We see the same thing. We see two strong main effects: verb frequency, sentence type, no interaction. So, you know, it looks like there's something like an interaction here. To the extent there's it's not at all reliable, but it's actually in the opposite direction of the one that's predicted by the syntax theories and the semantics theories. It should go down. It shouldn't go up like that. It's not reliable at all. And so, but it doesn't matter. So it's in the opposite predicted direction. And many of these verbs are unclassifiable in terms of factiveness and manner of speaking, but they're easily predicted in terms of their frequency, and you get these two main effects very easily falling out here. Okay, So in conclusion here, first, we failed to find evidence for interactions in the tested constructions. So contrary to the syntax and semantics kind of accounts of these kinds of islands, factive and manner of speaking islands. And second, we find strong evidence for a frequency account, which explains acceptability variance in both filler gap constructions and declaratives formed by verbs beyond these three categories. Okay, so the factive and manner of speaking island structures appear to be fully explainable in terms of frequency of the lexical and syntactic rules with no need for this unlearnable subjacency constraint. And if you're interested, this project started as a replication of Ambridge and Goldberg 2008. We were trying to replicate some stuff they did. And although we were very sympathetic to their background in this approach to explaining island phenomena, we don't think it applies in these examples. We think something more like their approach actually can explain other kinds of island effects, which I will get to soon now. Okay, so next, I spent a lot of time working with Anne Abeille, Barbara Hamforth, and Elie Winkel at University of Paris, initially on trying to understand subject islands, but more recently on many other types of constructions, both in English and in French. Always both languages, doing acceptability and corpus analyses in both languages together. So let's come back to subject islands again, as in one ours, which sports car to the color of the baseball player, they're not very good. Okay. Under the syntactic approach, these bad extractions from subject position have nothing to do with their meaning. Therefore, all extractions should be equally bad across constructions of different meanings. It turns out, though, that there are many attested examples. I've already told you about one. Mostly they're prepositional phrases from relative clauses as these in English. This punchy writing from Jane Austen, which I like so much, a letter of which every line was an insult. But we ran several experiments that were reported in Cognition in a paper in 2020, which tested the acceptability of extractions from subjects in WH questions and relative clauses. In WH questions, this is one of the experiments, results from one of the experiments here. We see the normal, so-called island interaction here, such that the extracted subject version is rated as much worse than the other three conditions. So this rating, this difference here is much bigger than this difference here. So the extraction from the object position isn't rated very badly at all. It's actually really well, and this one's rated much worse. But there is no such difference in relative clauses for very comparable materials. These are comparable materials here in terms of their words and everything. So, I mean, there's actually a bunch more conditions in each of these experiments. I'm just simplifying for the purposes of making a simple presentation. So here, extraction from the subject in a relative clause is rated as actually numerically better than extraction from the object in relative clause. I mean, there's no interaction here. There's just a main effect here, I think, of of course this is some baseline good sentence here coordination. They're not as good as those, but they're pretty good. They're actually okay for both of them. So I don't know, it's hard to say what good and bad are. They're not bad here. Oh, we do have ungrammatical controls, which are far below these cases here. Okay, so much better than those. So the examples are things like the dealer had a sports car of which the color delighted the baseball player versus extracting from the object the dealer had a sports car of which the baseball player loved the color. So these things, it turns out in English and French in the first experiments we ran, the prepositional phrase extraction was rated a little bit better. I don't want to make much of that. I just think that what's critical here is there's no difference. There's no difference between those two roughly in the relative clause. There's a huge difference in the WH questions. You throw them all into a regression. There's like a two-way interaction on those ones, or a three-way interaction if you put the either good or bad controls in. However you analyze this, there's a really big difference between what goes on in relative clauses and what goes on in WH questions. And this has been replicated now several times. There's a huge difference between there's more things to say here, which attentive listeners will be noticing that these things aren't identical. These materials here, in these cases, we're fronting an NP with we're stranding a preposition here. In these cases, we're fronting a prepositional phrase. These are just the examples which work best in each one of these constructions. You can do the prepositional phrase fronting in the WH questions, and there is some difference there. They're not very good though. People don't like WH questions with prepositional phrases. They like, for some reason in English, I don't really know exactly why that is, and they prefer the prepositional phrase extractions in relative clauses. And so there's some weird things going on here about English. If you look at French, you don't have this problem. You never have PP strand, prepositional phrase, or Italian, you don't have those things. And so the materials are a little bit more identical in cross WH questions and relative clauses, and you get the same result, in case you're interested. But no matter what, in each of these languages, the results run totally contrary to the syntactic view, where the effects are predicted to be, they're just kind of stated and must be the same across construction. So what do we think is going on? Well, we're following on actually old work by Ertushik-Shear. Noam Ertushik-Shear was, I don't know, ironically, a student of Noam Chomsky back in 1973, and was telling him about all these things, and somehow he didn't pay any attention, and as far as I'm concerned, to the neat insights that she had here. So her insight was, back in 1973, was that it's really got to do with focusing here, that you're focusing something which shouldn't be focused. This is a coming out of a background and unfocused position. You shouldn't be doing that. There's some, she didn't quite word it like this, but this is our version of this. So there's some a conflict here between focus and background. So a focused element, which is maybe a WH question, can't be part of an unfocused backgrounded constituent is our idea here. So let's just work through that a little bit. So under this hypothesis, our hypothesis, which I think is pretty, maybe, I don't know, Ertushik-Shear didn't work this out, but there's meanings for each of the rule types. So for, S goes to NP VP rule, but then there's WH question rule, and there's going to be a relative clause rule. There's a form for each of these. This is the form, and S is this is in like HPSG or GPSG format here. There's a form which is an S, can be expanded as an XP, which has got a WH feature, together with an S, which is missing an XP. This thing is the same, so it doesn't have that. And there's some slash feature percolation in case you do GPSG or HPSG. But not only is there a syntax, but there's a meaning. And the meaning, this question mark X here, part of the meaning, and the WH question means that X is what the speaker wants to find out about from her interlocutor. And that's the focus of the utterance. And for extraction from subjects, we run into a conflict. Subjects are topics. X is the topic. Topics are usually backgrounded, which is the opposite of focus in a way. And the domain of a focused element is determined by the phrase dominating that element. So trying to focus part of a subject results in trying to focus a backgrounded element, which is a conflict in what we think of as maybe in social conventions, innate social conventions. But focusing part of an object is okay, because that's part of the typical focus of a sentence. So that's okay. And on the other hand, in relative clauses, so this is just another rule here. So kids are learning these rules from exposure to WH questions or exposure to relative clauses. You run into these things, and you figure out how to form the thing in the right context of how to want to say this. And there's a form to that and a meaning associated with the relative clause. And the semantics of a relative clause is very different from the semantics of a WH question. The meaning of a relative clause just adds a property P of X to the meaning of the head noun, so we don't get a conflict here. So in this story, the meanings of these constructions are learned from experience with them. There's no learnability problem because we don't need to learn a constraint on unbounded movement. It's a constructivist bottom-up approach, trying to learn how to cover what I'm being exposed to as a learner, not trying to learn a top-down constraint, which applies generally to block my system from over-generating. We just don't have that in the system. So let's work this through a little, some more examples. So according to the focused background conflict constraint, I say, a focused element should not be part of an unfocused or backgrounded constituent. This constraint allows A, B, and E, because the focus domain for the focused element in each is just the focus of the clause, and the focus domain for a focused element is determined by the phrase dominating that position. So the sentence object, the object of color, and the sentence subject are all in the domain of focus of the whole clause, so that's okay. But C and D, these two are no good, because the focus domain for the focused element, of which car, is the subject, which is backgrounded, and then we have a conflict. So we get a discourse clash. And we ran parallel experiments in French showing the same effects. Extractions from parts of subjects in WH questions are not good. But extractions from parts of subjects and relative clauses are okay. So apparently this is okay. L'entreprise organise des activités dont certains aspects menacent la santé des employés. I don't have a judgment about that, but I don't speak good enough French to know if that's okay or not. Sprouse et al. Actually ran experiments looking at relative clauses and WH questions in English and Italian, and found the difference that we're proposing here in Italian, and they just didn't address the results theoretically. Okay. So on to some interesting predictions of this idea, this focused background conflict, where we're going to look at now other constructions. This constraint makes interesting for the predictions, some of which we've tested. First, we explored clefts. Clefts are really interesting from our perspective because their form looks just like relative clauses in some way, but their function is much more similar to WH questions with a contrastive stress meaning. So in an example like, it was Mary who ran the office, there's an implicit contrast with others at the office, and we were adding new information that Mary was the one who did this. To examine clefts, we wanted to use our relative clause items and just manipulate them, but actually they almost all use the preposition of, like as in the dealer had a sports car of which the color delighted the baseball player. And of clefts just don't sound good in English at all. And so you can't really say it was of the sports car that this color delighted the baseball player, or an object. You can't say it was of the sports car that the baseball player loved the color. I mean, they just sound bad. We actually did that experiment. They sound terrible. So we rewrote materials with other prepositions, like as in this case here, is over the British project that the vote concerns most Europeans, or it was over the British project that most Europeans discussed the vote. The focus background conflict constraint predicts a conflict here in extraction from subjects, because now we've got a focal discourse, we've got a focal construction here, unlike relative clauses, because of the focal nature of clefts, and that's exactly what we see. We see low ratings when in the materials when you're extracting out of subjects in clefts relative to out of objects in clefts. And those, there's some, I have some other controls here. These are ungrammatical controls kind of here, and these are the good controls here. And so that's what we found. We changed the materials, so then we need to go back and replicate the lack of conflict for relative clause versions of the same materials. We did that, and sure enough, there is no difference. It turns out in these cases, there's no difference for the same materials now rewritten as relative clauses. Both of these are okay. So that's like subject here, the media presented the British project over which the vote concerns most Europeans. And so if you run regression now with the construction type, the construction type, which is relative clause versus clefts, and position, you get the relevant interaction. So that is like the difference that you saw in the cleft is bigger than the sort of numerical difference that we see here in the relative clause. And we did this also in French, and we get the same results in French. Okay, so I'm not going to read these examples, but basically you turn those relative clause examples, which are actually okay, into French clefts, and they're bad. The clefts out of subjects are bad, which is really kind of cool. So critically, we across both languages, there's some penalty for clefting from such subject position. Another interesting prediction is that this hypothesis makes is that the graded nature of felicity of extraction. This is an old observation, actually also going back to Shear, 1973. And so this is okay. Which actress did you buy a picture of? But which actress did you buy that picture of is not very good. This falls from the focus background conflict constraint, because here I'm trying, this is okay to focus something out of something new, that's okay. But if I'm trying to focus something out of something backgrounded, which I'm doing here by making this change in the determiner here, so it's some definite thing, that's not very good. Here, but a neat prediction here is that if you switch the construction, should go away. That is, there should be less of a contrast or no contrast in relative clauses, and that's actually what the judgment is from the literature. We haven't run these experiments, but people have noted this and noted that they didn't have a good explanation for this. This is Grosu 1981. You see, again, it's fine to say this is the actress who I bought a picture of. I get the same, I don't know, we haven't done that experiment, but I get those judgments for what it's worth. I'm not making these judgments up. These are other people's judgments, but I actually share them for whatever that's worth. I would want to do the experiment. We just haven't got to it. This theory also predicts an improvement in extractions from subject position when the extracted position is focused in some way, either by intonation or, because I'm saying it's like the default subject position is usually it's just a background, the subject position is usually background, but it can be focused. And one way to do that is either by intonation or by using even and only. And so we have some suggested evidence that if you throw even and only in here, these things get a lot better. So just pulling WH questions, which car did the color of please the baseball player? Not very good. But if you say which car did even the color of please the baseball player, or only the color of, these things get a lot better, which is exactly, so basically instead of that being a default background, now we're forcing it to be a focus, which matches no longer a conflict, which is kind of cool. Now, finally, we've done the last thing I want to tell you about here is stuff we've done for adjuncts, parts of adjuncts. So again, these are proposed to be by Chomskyan syntacticians to be not generated. These extractions are not generated by the grammar, they're ungrammatical. Once again, we're going to find that extraction from parts of an adjunct are greatly improved in relative clauses compared to WH questions. So this is, again, another construction-dependent acceptability difference, which is predicted by the constructivist account, but not by this global syntactic violation account. So for the WH questions, we see an interaction effect for the extraction from part of an adjunct position. So that's like, where is it here? Which is B here. Which concert would Paul worry if I might miss? It's not very good. So that rating there is the lowest of the 4, and there's this difference is bigger than this difference. There's an interaction. The mean that like these don't pay too much attention to the z-scores. What those are z-scores are all, any ratings of acceptability are always relative to whatever else is in the material. Like people rate longer sentences lower than they rate shorter sentences. So that's like a theory of what ratings are, which is an interesting question. It's not, I'm not going to talk about that here. So what's critical here is an interaction. You put them into relative clauses. There is no interaction for extractions in similar cases in relative clauses. So this is like B again. Paul told me about a concert which he would worry if I might miss. So it's the same. Which concert would Paul worry if I might miss? Which concert would Paul worry if I might miss is not great, but Paul told me about a concert which he would worry if I might miss is not so bad. And so that's like, this difference here is not different from that difference there. And if anything, there's something in the opposite direction. I don't think it's reliable. So there's no interaction here. There is an interaction here. There's a three-way interaction. You throw them all into a regression. Which just all that means is that the effect in relative clauses of the extraction is much weaker than in WH questions. It's much stronger in WH questions than it is in relative clauses, as this focus background conflict thing hypothesis predicts. Okay, it's not. So here's one case though where something like the focus background conflict it's in the right direction, but I think it's not quite right. And so we did the same experiment. Turns out without if adjuncts, we used when adjuncts, and these are exactly the same materials as before, but now the adjunct is when as opposed to if. And so it's like, which concert would Paul worry when I might miss versus if I might miss? Okay, when, and what's different about if versus when? Well, when, syntactically maybe they're the same, but the meaning is different. So when is more backgrounded relative to if. If is possible worlds. When is something not possible worlds is definitely something we're supposed to both share. So in any case, we find this huge interaction in WH questions. So this is much the worst of the 4 conditions, and there's this big difference in the differences. That's this interaction. This is really bad. We actually see an interaction in the relative clauses as well, which is not predicted by the focus background conflict, but we see an interaction still. So this difference is bigger than that difference. If you throw them all into a regression again, you still see the predicted 3-way interaction. So the effect is bigger in WH questions than relative clauses, but there's still an effect in relative clauses. So that not actually consistent with the focused background conflict as stated. So that is, a focused element should not be part of an unfocused background constituent, right? According to that, there should be no penalty in relative clauses because we don't have a focused element, but there is a penalty. And so something's wrong here. So that's Paul told me about a concert which he would worry when I might miss. Isn't great, right? It's not perfect. And this thing says it should be fine, and the way as it's stated here. So a variant of the focused background conflict constraint is, instead of talking about focused background conflict, we just talk about foreground background conflict, okay? So instead of So a continuous version of this is more like a foregrounded element shouldn't be part of a backgrounded constituent. And this sounds more like what Adele was proposing, Adele Goldberg. She's saying backgrounded constituents are islands. So this is not exactly the same as what she's saying. She's only focusing on the position of where the things are coming out of. And what we're focusing on is that she's right about the background, but also it matters what the construction is, what you're using, what's the kind of movement, what's the kind of displacement that you're doing. So there's so that's, which is how foregrounded that is versus how backgrounded. So it's very similar to what she's saying. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar. So then the badness of a displacement isn't just it's not just like a binary thing, focus, not focus. It depends on the strength of the foreground in the construction and the strength of the backgrounding. And maybe focus, new, is just the extreme version of foregrounding, and maybe displacement generally foregrounds somewhat. And so maybe relative clauses do some kind of foregrounding relative to nothing, but the really extreme versions are things like clefs and WH questions. Okay, so roughly speaking, here's like a table of the predictions and what we see here and how we can explain the pattern of data we've seen so far. And so if we just change focus to foregrounded, we get everything that we had before. And so that is things like, the extraction is very strong. That's a focus. And it's coming from a part of a subject, which is a partly backgrounded thing. And so there's a strong conflict here. And we get less of a conflict in relative clauses because this foregrounding is much weaker. So we get easy to measure this. We didn't actually measure this. We don't find any effect there. Again, for extraction from if clauses, again, we get this strong conflict for WH questions and a weak conflict for relative clauses. But now when we just change the strength of the background, it is, even if we've got a weak foregrounding here, that may conflict somewhat with the background, and we get a medium conflict here, is the idea.
You should be concluding, excuse me.
I am almost done. We need to work this, it's good to work this model, this proposal out more examples, and with some independent measure of backgrounding, and we are currently working on this. I have 2 more slides. So one final slide before I wrap up is, I just want to mention that some work done by other labs, which is building on these ideas, is Rebecca Tolan from University of Delaware has some neat results showing the famous that trace effects in English are greatly mitigated in relative clauses compared to WH questions. So here's the classic that trace effect. Which family member did Lucy think that could drive granddad home? Her example is not good at all. I share that. Gets way better in a relative clause, fascinatingly. So the family member who Lucy thought that could drive granddad home knew Pat. So these are like, she ran these experiments rating these things, and there's a greatly mitigated effect of that trace effect in a relative clause compared to a WH question. So that's another example. And there's now so many of these cross construction, long distance extraction acceptability differences. They're big differences across constructions. You can't generalize. So the thing that was the basis for this theory, this unlearnability, isn't true, I would say. So data that are difficult for the original conception. So I presented data here that are difficult for the original conception of the constraint-based approach to handle, but which makes sense in a usage or construction-based setting. Some islands are sensitive to lexical frequency. That was Ying-Tong Liu's work. Subject and adjunct islands, where the acceptability varies depending on the construction, not purely syntactic. And we get similar results. All our experiments we do both in English and French, but other people have done some interesting work, which ends up being the same kind of result in Italian. Our conjecture, which I said earlier, is that maybe for other islands, the experiments just haven't been done right so far. Maybe they're confounded, and maybe all are explained by lexicon, plausibility, discourse, and memory. Again, the critical result is always an interaction, and it's hard to have intuitions about interactions. You need experiments to test that. So in conclusion here, I want to say that I don't see any remaining motivation for the nativist approach for understanding displacement phenomena. The data don't support such a claim, and the resulting theory without that hypothesis is much simpler, with less innate structure proposed in language. And I just want to acknowledge my wonderful collaborators. So Ying-Tong Liu again on the first project, and actually also Richard Futrell and Rachel Riskin, the 4 of us, but she was definitely the lead. And all 3 of these, Anne Ebeye, Barbara Hempforth, and Elodie Winkle, and working with me on all the cross-linguistic stuff in English and French. And I'd like to acknowledge National Science Foundation for funding this and other work in my lab over the years. And here are like so many people from my lab and other people who've motivated me over the years, including many linguists and some people maybe here. And I'll stop there and entertain however many questions you're willing to ask. Oh, I guess I went longer than I thought, which is how it always goes.
Well, we got more for our, can you unshare, please?
Sure.
Thank you very, very much for a wonderful, wow, talk, which went very fast. I don't see questions, but I have one that's kind of weird. Okay, so we call these filler gap dependencies, just assuming that we're talking about a filler and a zero. Okay, but if you think about it, okay, so I have claimed, of course, in the past that what you have here is a dependency where a zero is just too high an accessibility marker for this distance to maintain high accessibility. So fine, but so you could say, okay, language could resolve it. And it does resolve it, but very marginally with like resumptive pronouns. So my question is, I don't know if you have thoughts about this. Why is it that we have so many of these syntactic constructions, which could be resolved in terms of memory if you had a pronoun there, if you could allow a noun phrase? Probably that's not what they're for. That's not their use. And maybe the clue for the different acceptability of the various structures has to do with how many of them are more useful for us to have this dependency that is taxing on our memory load.
So your question is, why do we have these long distance dependency structures in languages that have them? Is that your question?
Not exactly, no. Why it's a problem, okay? It's a problem, okay.
Which I think is a very interesting question. If that's a question, I think that's a very interesting question. And I don't have an answer to that question. I think that's a very interesting question, but I haven't even thought about that question enough. So, but go on, what is your question, which is some narrower version, I guess, of that?
No, this is, sorry, so I'll let somebody else talk. I'm just saying that we've been stuck on this problem that presumably languages could have solved, but not to, and should tell us something, okay? They could have chosen just to have resumptive pronouns all over the place. It's not the case. So I think we should do something about it. I don't have the answer, but I'm just throwing it out in the air.
Well, I think that does reduce to why do we have filler gappy kind of things? That's what it reduces to, and I think it's a very good question, and I genuinely think that's a fascinating question, and I don't know the answer. I don't know if I have anything. I mean, I doubt. Probably some people have speculative answers. I don't even think I have a speculative answer at the moment, but I think that's a fascinating question. I mean, it's taken as a given in the Chomskyan framework, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And so like they're just taking, like, there's two things. There's, which are just core language, which are merge and move anywhere. And so move anywhere is the one that they say is just, he's built. So I guess Noam thinks it's just, I don't know what he thinks. He probably thinks it's some, it's a genetic component or something to this or something. But I don't like that answer. And so I think your question is a very good question. And I could speculate, but I maybe not like right now. I don't know if I can speculate well right now. Okay, there's two people with hands up, and there's two in the chat or Q&As. The one in the chat, okay, so which is start. Well, there was someone here earlier. Do you want to take your questions?
Do you want to take your questions?
Yeah, is that okay?
Please go ahead. Sure.
Okay, so the first one was from this guy Ryan Lai in the chat, who said, "Could I talk a little bit more?" It's a really good question. Could you talk a little bit more about how you would operationalize degree of backgrounding and foregrounding? And I think that's a very good question, because I just sort of said we need to do that, and we haven't done that. And I'm not aware of anyone having done that. I have ideas, but I don't know if any of them will work. I'll try some experimental things where we try to get people to rate various kinds of what they think the topic is about, what they think. I mean, I don't know if this is going to work at all. Experimental work is weird and hard, and so maybe it won't work at all to just ask people what they think is part of the context here. And sort of, I don't know if there's some kind of ways of asking about particular phrases in the sentences. That's the most dumb idea that comes to my mind, and trying to quantify that across different positions and different kinds of materials. But I don't know if that's going to work in whatever ways. So if people have other ideas about how to do that, it's a very good question, Ryan. Thank you. I don't know what the answer is exactly. We haven't done that. I said we're thinking about it, but we haven't done it. Okay, so I don't know who was next. It was either Jack or Elitzer. Do you guys know which of you was first? Okay, Elitzer, go first.
But it's your time, Jack, to be first. Last talk I took the. Okay, I'm going.
He's deferring to you, so go ahead.
Okay, so I have a very, really broad question, maybe clarification. I don't know how to phrase it. Thank you. It was a great talk, and I agree with everything. Like I'm sympathetic to everything, but what I'm missing is actually what makes things ungrammatical. So it's unclear to me in your approach why we even have this, like, why sometimes things are ungrammatical, why we have such a deep sense of some sentences as being ungrammatical, why we just like, okay, it's we haven't heard it, or like it takes us time to process. But sometimes we have a very strong feeling that sentences are just ungrammatical, and it's unclear to me, and I don't know what makes it ungrammatical according to your approach.
Okay, there's an easy answer to that. And so the answer to that is, like, when I first showed you like syntactic and lexical frequency, whatever's going on, I don't know it's the right answer, but there is an easy answer, which is there are conventions. There are conventional, whatever those, so it's basically rule frequency. The rule frequency drives what you're calling grammaticality. So if it doesn't generate, like there is something which is ungrammatical, which is not possible. If I give you, dog the, that's not English. I can't say dog the instead of the dog. There are conventionalized ways to put things together. So that's presumably zero frequency for the most part, or close to zero frequency. And so that's going to get me a very high surprisal response in that probabilistic context-free grammar. So close to zero compositional rule frequency that's my definition of, so that there's a continuum from
so
zero.
Just a follow-up question, because the problem is that sometimes we have things with with very low frequency.
Yeah,
sounds grammatical. So it doesn't go the other way.
Well, look, when I'm talking about the frequencies here, you're right, I have to work this out in a full model. I think that's the implicit comment there. But like the rule frequencies I'm talking about are rules like S goes to NP-VP, or what are relative clauses, or how you add adjectives to nouns. So they're all kind of compositional two and three placey things. Okay, they're all, so not for a whole sentence is a combination of all of those. And so then, the product of the grammaticality of a sentence, or acceptability of a whole sentence, is going to be, the product of the acceptabilities of all of those rules. Okay, so that's the proposal here. So I don't know if it's a very simple proposal. Will it work on so you got words, and the more you know them, the greater the frequency of those, the higher the activations in your brain and your head, and same for the combinations of the rules. And so that's the claim. And so those things, and so that was like kind of the first experiment actually showed there's like pretty strong sensitive to lexical sensitivity in some of those islands, and the syntax rule, which is the declarative versus the WH question. There's a huge frequency difference there in the syntax of declaratives versus WH questions. And so maybe that's what's driving that in some sense. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying there's a simple answer. Those are different things, right? So it's a simple proposal which will cover a lot of things. Does it work in the extreme? It's very simple. And so maybe it will, maybe it won't. I don't know.
Okay, the next two questions, Jack and Yael Z, but please make it short.
Okay, my question is a sort of general one.
Questions. Yeah, okay.
A general question about frequency, which usage-based linguists we all love, but you seem to be taking the position that many people would take, that frequency of constructions is at least one factor driving acceptability. But I'm wondering if it could go, the causality could go in the opposite direction, such that acceptability through possibly unknown additional factors is driving frequency. That is a particular combination of lexical items and structures and so on is just better for some reason, and then people use it more often. So this is definitely something that I don't have a good answer to, but is that something that would concern you?
So I maybe my connection is bad or yours or something. I think it's mine. I don't know if I dropped off. So I understood I heard most of the question, which was like the direction going from frequency to acceptability. And you're talking about acceptability to frequency. Now, can you give me an example of how acceptability, what do you mean by acceptability driving? So basically something about the concept there is the idea, something about the concepts driving what we want to say. Is that what you mean? Like when the concepts sort of make sense together, that's going to cause why I want to say them. Is that what you mean?
Something like that, but more you take whatever functional factors have been appealed to in any combination. So let's say respecting expectations about backgroundedness versus foregroundedness. If you know, whatever combination of cognitive motivations make something easier to process, does that just make you want to produce that structure more often, or make it more reliable to, let's say, choose a stereotypical lexicalized sentence stem that has the right properties that sort of keep you out of trouble? So in other words,
it's possible,
yeah.
But I don't see it, like off the top of my head. I would go the other direction. I see the other direction very easily. So I see usage driving acceptability. I find it a little hard to see how. I don't, without a detailed example, I don't really get. It's very easy this direction. The other direction feels a little confusing to me. Maybe it's possible, and I'm just dense.
Yeah,
right
I think
now.
it would need a detailed, you know, fleshing out of the how to define the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting other question there is like, what drives those frequencies? I mean, I think that's a very interesting question. So where are the frequencies? They're not just accidental. I mean, they kind of are in some sense as far as the language is concerned, maybe, but maybe they are driven by cultural constraints of some kind or other. So maybe that's what you're asking is where those frequencies are. Am I bottoming out there? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, I kind of am because I'm mostly interested in language, but probably there are some other kinds of interactive and cultural constraints which drive the frequencies to some extent, which I haven't worked on at all, but I agree with that. I mean, I don't think they do. I don't think it ends there. It's just frequencies.
As a chair, let me intervene. There's another question maybe you can answer very quickly, I hope, in the Q&A about languages that don't have SVO order, like SOV. Yeah. Did you look into those?
No, I mean, no, that's an interesting. So, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, so these languages I mean, if you're languages have displacement constraints like related to English, maybe if you want to look at German and Dutch, which are kind of underlyingly SOV. I mean, the prediction is no, they wouldn't make, but probably there's some interesting ways in which they would be different. But I don't know I do know something about German, and I mean, those are just two kinds of SVO languages. I'm not sure. SOV languages, maybe really SOV languages would do something interestingly different. I don't know why they would though. Anyway.
All right. That's something for some graduate student to pick up, maybe.
For sure.
All right, guys. Thank you very, very